Now to what is still a big issue and will continue to be for a long time yet, the beginning of the return of ISIS brides and their children to Australia. Last week we brought you two really powerful points of view, both opposed to their repatriation.
The Yazidi community has been very unhappy about this decision, and just imagine to see the people who killed your family and your sisters and brothers and fathers. How are you going to feel?
They would use their women and children as a shield, and the consequence of that is that now you've got young children. When children in our society at that age are watching the Wiggles and Cocomelon, children at that age in the Islamic State were watching their father commit public beheadings.
Tonight, the other side. My next guest believes what the government is doing is the right thing, not just for the women and children involved, but for the rest of us. I'm not convinced, but it's too important an issue not to provide a platform for debate. Fionnuala Ni Aolain is United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Counterterrorism, and she joins me now. Fionnuala, thank you so much for your time. Can you understand the community concern here in Australia?
Well, let me say this. First of all, let's just talk about, looking at the security precautions that have been put in place. I'm not an insider to the Australian intelligence services, but I have spoken at length to the intelligence and security communities in Australia. And I am 100% sure that all of the security measures that are needed are being put in place.
The term ISIS brides, is that something you're comfortable with?
I just would profoundly disagree with that terminology. Many of these individuals, these children, are victims of terrorism. They did not choose to be born in northeast Syria. They didn't choose to go there. They actually had no hand at all in anything that happened to them. Many of them have been brutalised in multiple ways, including by the failure to bring them home. And I would say, in relation to the women, I would just caution people in terms of the kind of inflammatory language that's often used around these women.
Oh, look, I don't think anyone would argue with the fact that the children are victims. Absolutely. It's horrific what they've gone through. It is so, so sad. I just worry that because of their circumstances, they could then potentially pose a threat.
I would also say, look, we could say the same. Children in Australia grow up in broken homes. They grow up in poor neighbourhoods. They're exposed to violence in families, in communities, on the street. We don't relegate those children to sort of having no rights simply because of what happened to them. Even at home in Australia, we say these are Australian nationals. Their parents may have done X, Y, or Z. They may have been exposed to violence in the home, on the street, but actually they're entitled as Australian citizens to be treated with dignity.
Fionnuala, you weren't comfortable with the term ISIS brides. I'm not really comfortable with the term broken home. I've got a 4-year-old. Her father and I separated. I think it's really hard to compare a child who's been through a separation to a child that's been asked to hold a decapitated head.
So I would tell you with absolute conviction and the evidence, not a single child who's come back to Australia has had to hold a decapitated head. But I would say children who've grown up in households with extreme violence, as happens in many Australian homes, are children who are traumatized. We don't presume that they're going to end up violent by virtue of having been in a household where a father was violent, where a father was engaged in criminality, where a mother may have been engaged in criminality. We don't make that presumption. And I think actually we should seriously pull apart the kinds of assumptions we have about these children.
But we have seen images of children, an Australian child holding a decapitated head. Now, I'm not saying that they're the ones coming back to Australia, but I'm making the point that this is what ISIS exposes kids to.
I would just say there are 60,000 children in these camps, more or less. And that example of a child showing a decapitated head, of course, that's a challenge, but it's so minuscule to the proportion of children who've experienced conflict violence, who've more than anything else experienced a lack of health care, a lack of water, a lack of food, a lack of nutrition. It's actually those things, those fundamental health and security things that have been most prominent in these children's lives.
So what steps need to be taken to ensure the safety of all our kids, of us here in Australia? What needs to be done that is evidence-based here?
Well, I think we have a ton of good evidence on how to prevent extremism and violence in society. Actually, it's not rocket science. It's pretty simple. We have a ton of good evidence from other jurisdictions who brought back their children that what they have to do is actually the bread and butter things that you do for every child. You educate them. You give them home and security. You ensure that they have access to their families, their grandparents, and a positive social environment. You make sure that the trauma they've experienced from being in a conflict zone, from experiencing malnutrition, exposure to scabies and all kinds of preventable diseases, you address that. I think the second thing I would say in relation to the women who've returned is that indeed there's a range of evidence available to the Australian authorities. And in many countries, I'll give you an example. We had returns to Belgium and to Germany in the last week. And in a number of those cases, because the government had evidence, they prosecuted. But let's also be clear. If the evidence is that a person was abducted against their will, a person was groomed online, a person was subject to coercive control while they were under the control of ISIS, that they had no possibility of exit, that they were brutalized and harmed by this horrendous terrorist group, like so many others, then as a dignified, civilized society, which Australia is you treat victims as victims and not simply punish a person because they ended up in a situation of being a victim.
We had a member of the Yazidi community on last week. You heard him speaking at the start of our interview. And he watched members of his family being marched to the foot of a mountain and shot by ISIS. I think a lot of people would struggle to consider those victims in the same class or category as a woman who's made a decision to follow her husband over to join a terrorist organisation.
So I'll say really honestly, and again, I think in a dignified and civilized society, we don't create hierarchies of victimhood. We don't say, well, this woman was more abused than that woman, and therefore this woman is a worse victim of domestic violence than that woman. Because actually that's a zero-sum game for victims as a whole. We have classes of victim. We recognize victims of terrorism as a cohesive but complex class. There's different people that different things happen to, but we don't take away the title of victim simply because different people had different experiences. And hierarchies of victimhood don't work for anybody. They don't work for the victims themselves. And they certainly, I think, don't work for the state to manage and ensure that each victim is treated with the dignity and respect that every single victim, child or adult, deserves.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think you've given us a lot of food for thought there. I don't know how many people will agree, but it's been a really eye-opening chat for me. I thank you so very much for your time. I really do.
Thank you.